So welcome to my journey to the epoxy river table that I'm building. I have these slabs over here, a 2 3/4 inch curly maple that's been seasoned for 5 years that I'll be making a river table out of with epoxy. And as I go through this process, I'll be kind of documenting it and doing kind of a how-to, what have you, to do the table. I've already allocated the slabs and I filled all the knots with the epoxy. You want to go get a nice, a nice epoxy resin. I'm using Pro Marine resin. Found that on the old Amazon. Anyway, filled all the knots. I've made my form with MDF here. MDF is just a nice, cheap, very smooth particle board that's going to hold the resin in very nicely. It's a nice smooth finish. You don't want to go with a rough plywood. You want a nice smooth MDF. And I'm using Tyvek tape as a mold release. Typically, a lot of people will use, wax mold release. The Tyvek, I read, is a much better release for the epoxy. So when I lift the table off and take the frame apart and the epoxy set, it won't rip up the particle board with it. Okay, so I've gotten the Tyvek on the MDF, and like I said before, this Tyvek is the best release to use when doing using an epoxy. The epoxy usually can, if you don't use the Tyvek tape, which I found out on the internet, so when you're researching this stuff, you want to make sure you learn off other people's mistakes. So my goal here is to try to make this easy as possible, right? And you can learn from me, hopefully, and do your own table that'll last, a few generations, hopefully. This Tyvek tape was about 25 square feet of roll. It was about $11. So I spent $22 on tape, to set the forms. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my forms up on the edges so I can hold the table in place and then tape the seams. I mixed up my resin. It's a 1-to-1, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a paintbrush. I'm going to apply the epoxy to the rough edge and try to get it into as many cracks as possible. Okay, as you see, I've painted the edge of the wood here. The exposed side that has all the crevices. Okay, so now I'm going to do my final pour here. Not final pour, but one of like 4 pours. 4 gallons total right now.
Dump it off.
When this cured, there's an exothermic reaction, and I heated up really badly because I poured too thick, and I actually cupped the table. So the next scene after this, showing the finished table, was me taking it back to a planer about a year later to smooth out the table. So these final images are nice, but the table's cupped and it needs to be repaired. Put up against the planer, you can see that it is very cupped, maybe about an inch off on areas. We had to do multiple passes on this. We took off about 60 pounds from the table to get it smooth again.
So the table's back from the planer, and the planer, the 52-inch wide planer, had a 6 grit drum on it. So, or 6 grit belt on it. And it chopped it up pretty nice, smoothed it out, but now I gotta get the grooves out. So I'm using a 180 grit, and you know, you don't need to go higher than a 180 grit. I'm gonna be lacquering this instead of doing a flood coat. I didn't like the flood coat. The flood coat made it a little plasticky. You know, with the kids touching it all the time with their fingers, dirty fingers, it's hard to keep clean. So this time we're gonna go a little more of a satin finish with a satin lacquer. And satin lacquer is nice because you don't need to go higher than a 180 grit because it does smooth it out. So I'm at a 180. I'm just gonna 180 this whole thing and call it a day. And then go get some lacquer and make this table nice and pretty. Okay, here's the final piece to the puzzle. It's been a long time coming. I think I bought this slab, 2 years ago. So it's just been a long journey. The funny thing is I'm now resurfacing it or finishing it with, this will be the second time I've done it. The first time was with the epoxy, and it was a flood coat, so it was completely coated in epoxy. And epoxy is nice, but it's something to think about when you're doing, you know, woodworking or working on tables or cabinets or any kind of finishing where you want the final product to be either high gloss coat or a stain or an epoxy or a lacquer or shellac. There's so many options. And I think the epoxy for me just was too glossy. It was a really high gloss and a high sheen. And with the kids always touching it, you know, and putting their hands on it, it was always smudgy. You know, it would really pick up on any kind of marks on it or anything. So it's just something to think about. You know, I'm gonna go with a lacquer. I think with a satin lacquer, it does a high durability. It's not as glossy. It doesn't have a high sheen, but it does have that protection. And it's a better protection than if, you know, you just went with like a wax or an oil. You know, even shellac is, you know, it's a little too much, I think, and it also can cause some different colors that I don't want. This is a nice curly maple. I want the grain to come through and not really darken up. So, okay, well, here goes with the lacquer.